in Proverbs,
chapter 20.
starting with verse 5. So we're moving into the next section. So we're running a little bit behind. I had a short night planned, but we started late, so now we'll have to run long to make up for it.
No.
Oh yeah.
Started late, we got to leave early.
No, I got to run long to make up
I
for it.
agree. I agree about
All right,
that.
so in the next section, we're going to study 33 verses. Not all tonight. Relax.
Yeah.
Goodness gracious. A little encouragement from the back would be just,
That's it.
no, brother, you are the back. He's like, who's in the back? Who's in the back? Okay, so we're really going to be in these next 33 verses. This is kind of a study, a character study, good and bad character, right? And we can further break down our study. There's discernment and integrity, verses 5 through 12. Moral character, verses 13 through 23. And authority of judgment by the king and of course God. And that's the last set of verses 22 through the first 3 verses of 21. Wow, say that 3 times really fast. So discernment, integrity is first, and that's what we'll look at first. And that's actually the section I had planned for tonight. So we will look at that, and and the fate of the wicked, the last 4 verses, fate of the wicked. So that's how this next section breaks down, okay? So it is going to be, we're going to be looking at the positive and negative of human character as we go through this. So the first subgroup there is discernment and integrity. Discernment, and of course you'll remember in the very beginning we talked about what Proverbs was intended to do. Proverbs was intended to teach us discernment, okay? And discernment simply means, very simply, and we can get real biblical and real scholarly in our definitions, but real simply, discernment is being able to tell a difference. So if you go to the supermarket and they got watermelon on sale, right? You stop at the watermelon box and you start thumping watermelons. Right? And what are you trying to do? You're trying to discern between the good and the bad watermelon. Right? That's what you're looking for. And so that's kind of the way God does us, right? God comes down out of heaven and he thumps us, right? And he's looking for the good and the bad. Right? And because it's all ugly for him, but he's looking for the good and the bad. And so, and of course,
You didn't bring enough for all of us. Get out of here.
Well, come sit next to me. We'll share. Lady the Tramp style.
Hey, I'll tell you, it's not worth it going after him like that because he just
Well, I know he's just
like, okay, fine, whatever. I'll share whatever I got with you. There you go.
I got 2 meatloafs. Sorry.
So to discern simply means to tell the difference between, right? And so that's a really big problem that we have as human beings, is being able to tell a difference, okay? Now, integrity, that was the second part of our section here, simply means a firm adherence to a code of especially moral or artistic values. It's incorruptibility. It's an unimpaired condition or soundness, wholeness, okay? Or this quality or state of being complete and undivided. How many of y'all have known somebody who lives by a code and they make no exceptions, right? few years ago, it's been several years ago now, John Wayne made a movie, right? It was the last one he made, The Shootist, right?
No, that was the last one he made.
What was
Alamo was the last one he made.
Alamo?
Yes.
No way.
No.
How do you
Shootist.
figure Alamo?
Shootist was the last one.
He was in his 70s when he made The Shootist.
Shootist was
The one with Ron Howard. Ron Howard wasn't even born in the Alamo.
Look it up.
Look it up.
It's worth the Google.
So, but anyway, the character that he plays, the young man asks him a question, and what he says is, I live by a code. I won't allow myself to be handled. I won't do this. I won't allow this. I won't allow this, etc., and so on and so forth. And so he had a very integrity simply means you stick to, there's no judgment, no good or bad, but you stick to a code. Right? You are always going to follow this code. That's integrity. Now, we have kind of come to accept integrity always as a positive thing. But integrity in and of itself is neutral. You have a code and you stick to it. Right? Your code may be shoot first, ask questions later. Which could be good or could be bad. Right?
I thought integrity was doing the right thing even when no one's looking.
That's character.
That's character.
That's character.
That's morals.
Okay.
Okay, and we'll get into that. We're gonna cover that as
Meatloaf.
That's a
Sorry.
pretty good dinner there.
It was. My wife loves me.
So I'll give you a good example of integrity. So when I was in internal affairs, we would investigate employees who were accused of things, and either it was unfounded, means it didn't happen, unsustained, which means there's no evidence to support the claim, sustained, which means they did it, or exonerated, which means they did it, but they were justified in doing what they did. So for the employees who the complaint was sustained against them, they violated policy most of the time. Sometimes they violated law. If they violated policy, we gave them a chance in our interview with them to save face, to give them an out, for them to restore their integrity. In other words, own your mistake, restore your integrity.
Right.
That's it. Because if it's a code, there are people who have a code that say, I'm not perfect, but if I mess up, if I sin, I will own my sin. That's their code they live by.
Right.
That's their
I
integrity.
own my mistakes.
Yes.
And so integrity, like for instance, like he's talking about the
The Shootist was not his last movie.
what was?
It wasn't the Alamo.
It was a year later. He had a cameo on Star Wars movie.
A cameo.
His voice. His voice.
Don't matter. He was in it. So
He was already dead.
Okay, so that's exactly what we're talking about here.
A cameo.
We have a code of I cannot be wrong ever, and I will live according to that code.
Well,
I'm
you know,
Alabama,
they
right?
interviewed him. He's from Alabama.
That's
They
it.
think they're perfect.
We are.
Just in fact.
So at any rate, what Brother Shannon's talking about is the department has a policy, right? So an officer's integrity doesn't mean he's choosing between right and wrong. It simply means he is always and without exception following policy. That's integrity. He follows the code. Now we'll get into where and although it won't be tonight because we're already a quarter of the way through. Won't be tonight, but in the next set of verses, we're going to talk about the difference between integrity and morality. Okay, if we get enough time, I'll go a slide or two deep. So let's look at the first set of verses that we have. Again, I'm going to read from the New Living Translation, the NLT. So if you're following along in the King James version, it's not going to look similar, but the intents are mostly the same. So starting in verse 5, that's where we're going to pick it up. Proverbs chapter 20. Though good advice lies deep within the heart, a person with understanding will draw it out. Many will say they are loyal friends, but who can find one who is truly reliable? The godly walk with, there's our word, integrity. Blessed are their children who follow them. When a king sits in judgment, he weighs all the evidence. Now, we talked about that a couple of chapters back, right? Where Solomon and the two ladies of the evening had the baby, right? And Solomon made no comment until he had heard all of the argument. When a king sits in judgment, he weighs all the evidence, distinguishing the bad from the good, or discerning. That's our other word. Who can say, I have cleansed my heart, I am pure and free from sin? False weights and unequal measures. The Lord detests double standards of every kind, and boy, we got a problem there. Even children are known by the way they act, whether their conduct is pure and whether it is right. And I liked verse 12. Ears to hear and eyes to see, both are gifts from the Lord. And it's not talking about sensory perception. Okay? It's a little bit deeper than that. So let's unpack some of this. So the New Living Translation here gets a little clumsy in verse 5, and it makes it sound like good advice is really deep in a person's heart. You really got to dig for it, and that's not where it's going with that. The NIV in this particular case renders this more accurately as the purposes of a person's heart are deep, or the motives of a person's heart are deep. So what's really being taught to us here is that to truly understand someone's motives, we can't take them at face value. We have to do a little digging. Okay? That a person's motives are not generally easily understood or easily visible, right? You've all run across people who have seemingly inexplicable phobias, fears, reactions. You might find a woman who hates men. You might find the reverse, a man who hates women. You might find someone who's very harsh, and just tries to bite your head off every time. And if you really get to digging into their heart, into what makes them tick, you might find a lot of hurt and a lot of pain. A woman who's been left by a husband who's been betrayed by a wife, a man who's been abandoned by family, right? And so actions that we might on the surface interpret as meanness or as orneriness, as hedonism, right, might be caused by some deeper set of motives. And you can't just look at somebody, well, unless you have a gift from God, right, where he reveals to you some secret. You don't just look at somebody and go, oh, I see what your problem is, right? A lot of times this pain or these experiences manifest themselves in someone's life in truly odd ways, considering what's going on, circumstances and that kind of thing. Loss of a parent, loss of a child, all of these things contribute to a person's presentation to others, and they're not always obvious. As a matter of fact, they're rarely obvious, and that's what this verse is talking about here. The motives that someone has, these are deep within the heart. A person of understanding will draw them out. So we have to be not only astute, but we have to understand what we're looking at. Right? How many times how many times have you made a judgment on someone only to find out later that there's been some event in their lives or some trauma, and you're like, well, that explains a lot, right? And you actually back up and go, I misjudged, right? I did not understand the pain or the event that occurred. I get people look at me and say that a lot, right? Oh, that explains a lot, right?
It really does.
See? So that's what this verse is trying to tell us is people are complicated. They're not always easily understood, especially by those of us who are mired in the same swamp that they are. Okay? Verse 6, which many will say they are loyal friends. Who can find one that is truly reliable? Simply reminds us that true and loyal friends are hard to find. Right? There's a lot of people who are our friends until the fan starts. You get my drift. Okay, so there are. He's looking at me like, what?
I know what you're saying.
So if you have a truly loyal or a truly reliable friend, right? This is a treasure. They're hard to find. And that's all this verse is doing, is it's reminding us that kind of a friend, you know, I had read somewhere, and I don't remember where, but that the time and effort that goes into maintaining close relationships is something that we just don't have a lot of. And so each person will have a circle of friends that are their closest friends. And that number is generally not very large. 1 or 2 or 3 at most, right? Then there's a circle of friends who orbit a little further away, and that might be, you know, a much larger number, 8 or 9 or 10. And then, of course, there's, you know, and the further away you go, the less acquainted you are, the less time you spend investing in that relationship.
Well, even Christ experienced that himself.
Right.
With the apostles, it was Peter, James, and John. With his earthly friendships, it was Lazarus and his 2 sisters. So, yeah, even Christ himself had to experience that. So
right.
We understand why we go through that.
Why we're like that. We just can't put that kind of time in, right? So if we have someone in that near orbit who is true and loyal, then we have a treasure. Okay? And that's all verse 6 is talking about. Verse 7 is our verse on integrity, right? The godly walk with integrity, blessed are their children. So here we first start talking about integrity. And it mentions integrity, but notice in that same verse, it says the godly walk with integrity. Now, we had quite the discussion just a moment ago on integrity. We had quite the discussion, right? Integrity is just the strength of keeping to a code, which is why when you saw the word in verse 7, integrity, what did you see the word following? Wasn't rhetorical. I was looking for some.
It sounded very rhetorical.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't rhetorical, brother.
Rhetorical.
Yeah, it wasn't rhetorical either.
Righteous.
What did the word integrity? Remember, integrity is just the strength, the adherence to a code. But let's read it again. I'll just keep you up.
His children are blessed.
The godly walk with integrity. The children are blessed. The children are blessed not because their parents are very strict about keeping to a code, but there's a secret there, a word that tells us what kind of code.
My Bible says righteous, but godly.
Godly, righteous. Very good. Righteous. The righteous are someone who are following God's standards, God's code of ethics, right? God's policies, God's teachings, and they stick to them. The godly. And the children are blessed because the parents keep to the code. How many of y'all have ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean? Right? And so at one point in that movie, you know, what does the first mate say? Somebody says something, well, you know, the code, what about the code? And he says, well, you know, the code is really more like guidelines, you know. So there's no integrity there because the code only applies when we want it to apply, right? See? So y'all starting to get an idea now of integrity. But the godly with integrity means they hold to God's standards, God's morals. Their children are blessed because of their adherence to the code, right? They're blessed by that upbringing. Everybody's very quiet, so okay. Now, when verses 6 and 7 are taken together, and this is a freebie, so you're going to get this one at no extra charge. When you take the part about loyal friends and the godly walk with integrity, right? What you can infer from that is that loyal friendships have a foundation in a strong morality, God's morality, right? So your true friends are those friends you find in faith. Now you might say, "Oh, look, I've got a friend, and you know we were in the war together, or we did all these other things together, or we came up together." And I say that's great, and that might be a good friend. But a truly loyal friend, the friendship is based on something more than shared experiences or common backgrounds, common interests. Think about marriage for a minute. Marriages that last the longest are marriages between two friends. Marriages that last the longest are marriages with a foundation based on something outside of themselves. Interests. How many of you can say that all of your interests as an adult are the same interests that you had as a child? Now, you might have one or two or three that have followed you along, but as you become an adult, your interests have changed. Okay? Now, you might, like I said, you might have a couple of things that you used to do as a child that you still do here, but other interests have changed. For the guys, I can speak for the guys. Good. How many of y'all might have wanted to be a fireman when you grow up? I mean, just were dead set, I want to be a fireman or an astronaut. And very few of us grow up to be that, right? You had something you wanted to be as a child that you thought you were going to grow up to be. Are you that? And Shane's over here going,
I was later on in life.
no.
Not even close.
So I'm just using that as an example. Interests change, right? And so a marriage based on common interests is in trouble. Because, that's why sometimes you get one or the other in a marriage going, we just grew apart. Or I've got to go find myself, because interests change. But if the relationship is built on God's morality, right? God's code, if that is the basis of a friendship, then you have a much longer-lived relationship than just, we grew up together. There's a lot of people I grew up with. I couldn't tell you where they're at today to save me. We said, we went to the same high school together. We got kicked out of the same high school together, right? We put your fingers in your ears. You can't hear this. we did a lot of running from the cops together. Okay?
Statute of limitations is
I've done that.
Yeah, that's probably.
And he's a cop.
And he's a cop.
We're talking.
Yeah, I think the statute of limitations on that runs out after about 100 years. So I'm saying plus,
a class A misdemeanor. It's a
Yeah.
statute of limitations.
plus, running from the cops on horses wasn't near as exciting as in a car.
Yeah.
So,
Y'all thought that was funny, didn't you?
Really funny. It was pretty funny.
I'll tell you one thing.
yes, sir.
Two people just alike won't last in a marriage.
Well, that's true. This is what needs to be. There needs to be at least a gender difference. Oh wait, no, that's okay.
No.
Yeah.
Male and female.
You're right. You're right.
Because me and my wife was as different as night and day.
Likewise.
I'm not even gonna ask which one you
Me and
was
Shannon are
night and day,
about
but you're right. You're right. There's got to be.
Clumsy. I think that's about it.
It's the old adage, right? Opposites attract.
Yes.
You know. But again, when you look at verses 6 and 7 together, right? True and loyal friends are hard to find. Then it starts talking about integrity, strong moral code. I think that's where you find the basis of a long-lasting and strong friendship. And marriage is probably the deepest form of friendship that you can have. If you're not friends with your spouse, then
You got problems.
yeah, I'll just refer you to the pastor for marital counseling. That's where we got to go with that one. So moving on, looking at verse 8. So if we look at verse 8, let me just reread that again to keep us honest here. When a king sits in judgment, he weighs all the evidence, distinguishes the bad from the good. If you take that from the Hebrew literally, it's not when, it is a statement of fact. A king sits in judgment. Right? And so you have to understand a monarchy, right? In a monarchy, the king is what we would consider all three branches of government. He's the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. So a king sits in judgment. And a king sits in judgment to discern or to distinguish the good from the bad. He must weigh all the evidence. And we've talked about Solomon before. When we take that verse about a king sitting in judgment, and they must be able to distinguish or discern, weigh all the evidence, distinguish the bad from the good, and we couple that with the godly walk with integrity, we get then a sense that justice can only be served by a strict adherence to the code. Okay? Now, on the spiritual side, we're talking about God's morality, God's code, God's law, God's teachings. On the human side, the problem that we have is we can make a law that's completely counter to what God teaches us, right? And so again, we have to go back. Integrity is neither good nor bad. We have to apply God's standards and then stick to them. That's the key to good judgment, is sticking to a standard. You know, one of the things I had read some time ago, I had read a book by a man named Simon Greenleaf. Simon Greenleaf was a Harvard law professor back in the 1700s. And you think, well, today we have a lot of people questioning the Gospels, questioning about, well, it's been like that throughout all of history. And so Simon Greenleaf had the same thing going on in his world at his time. And so he wrote a little book. It's not a very thick book, but it is a rather difficult read because he's a law professor. And so he has a tendency to speak in those terms. And what he did was, in order to prove to his fellow law professors who believed that, their review of the law made them scholarly and, they could reject Scripture, he said, if we were to take the testimony of the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we were to haul those documents into court, if we use the logical rules of evidence, what would we find about those 4 books? And he goes through this whole examination based on the laws of evidence that are still in use in courts today, okay? and the end result is you would have to accept them as true, right? But one of the things that he notes as you go through this reading is that throughout all of human history, all of the religions presented to man except one have over time degraded and debauched themselves. And his conclusion was the reason that has happened is because they were invented in the mind of man. And so the religion or the moral code provided by that religion can only be as good as the mind that conceived it. Are y'all with me? And what? Was that a yes? Are you with me? Is that what you were saying? That's good. No, I'm glad you understand. I thought that's what I saw. I thought your hand went up like, yeah, I got that. So, okay. So even a young man like him can understand it. Put the rest of us to shame. So the reason that the religion, the spiritual and religious presentation of who we know as God and Jesus Christ, the Old Testament and the New Testament, you can go back through history and that religion, the Jewish religion and the Christian religion have not changed in centuries. And his conclusion is the reason it hasn't changed is because that moral code did not come from the mind of man. It came from something much higher and much more, to coin a term, righteous than us. Okay? And so when we see a king sitting in judgment, if he has personal integrity to God's moral standards, then justice is done. If he has no integrity, or if his integrity, his allegiance to a code is not based on God's moral law, then justice is not done. Right?
To the casual observer, one would make the assumption and the assertion that Christianity and the Jewish faith have in fact changed. But the truth is, the faith itself has not changed. It is the practicers of the faith who have bastardized and made a mockery of that faith,
right,
by not living by the code.
So one could say then that the faith has not changed, but the level of integrity of the
practicers
is what has changed. They have lost some of the integrity.
They do not walk in the light to the best of their ability.
To the best of their ability.
They are rejecting light by rejecting sound doctrine.
Right. And we can see that as an eventual conclusion. Jesus, was it Jesus? Yeah, it was Jesus who said, except those days be shortened, right? In the last days, except those days are shortened, no one will remain as a Christian. Right? And that's kind of what we're talking about here. Now, when we take verses 6 and 7 and we add them to verse 9, it cautions us to remember and be aware of our own sins and shortcomings. Verse 9 was this: who can say, I have cleansed my heart, I am pure and free from sin? So if we are given the responsibility of making judgments on something, maybe we're a boss, or we're a manager or supervisor at work, or something where we have to discern the bad from the good. We have to distinguish bad from good, right? Whatever that is, right? One of the things that we're reminded is no one can truly say, I have no prejudice, no bias. We all do. Mm-hmm. It's important then that we remember Jesus taught us what? What's the one thing that non-Christians want to throw in our face every time we get into a heated discussion with them, right? You're judging me. Aren't you a Christian? You're not supposed to be judging me, because what did Jesus say? Judge not, lest ye be judged, right? But what he was saying, and if you really study those sections of Scripture, he was saying, do not judge according to your own standard.
What it says, don't, unless you be judged by the same judgment.
Right, you'll be judged by the same judgment. So I can render to you what God says about some subject, but I cannot pass judgment or levy a sentence on you, right? That's not my role. I can tell you what God says. God says that this sin or that sin or this or that thing will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. But if I point my bony finger at some individual and say, you will not go to heaven because you are chewing bubblegum, and chewing bubblegum is a sin, because my first grade teacher told me it was. Okay? Well, so what happens if on that person's deathbed they come to know Christ? They accept him as their Savior. Well, I've just told them they won't go, and yet they will be there, right? So we have to be careful. We could say to someone, God calls this a sin, and those people who participate in it die with their sins on their heart. God says you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Those people will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, I just believe different. Well, you can believe different if you want to, but that's not going to change God's mind. I had a guy tell me one time, I don't believe in God. I said, you're going to have a real difficult time when you meet him.
Yeah.
He said, I'm not going to meet nobody. I said, okay. I'm sorry. There's nothing more for us to talk about. But just remember, when you get there and he ends up real, right? And he ends up real, you were warned. And that's really all we can do when it comes to judgment, right? Mm-hmm. Is we can warn them. Hey, don't be doing 80 miles an hour down this road. The bridge is out. If you don't stop, you'll end up in the river. And then we hope that they blow right by us, right? And we hope that they stop before they get there. And that's all that we can do. All right. Now, verse 10 even adds more to this. Remember, so we got a king sitting in judgment, or, you as a manager, supervisor, someone who has responsibilities. Justice is an important thing. And when we go on to verse 10, basically says false weights and unequal measures. The Lord detests double standards of every kind. Double standards of every kind. All of them. And it uses false weights. And that's because, back in the day, counterweight was used to determine value, right? So y'all all seen the old pier and beam scales, right? Where it's got the yoke that sits on a deal. It's got the two little trays, and so you take something that is known as a weight, you put it in this side, and then you would pour out gold or silver or wheat or whatever. And when they balanced, you'd say, okay, that's X number of ounces, pounds, whatever. And, I'm either paying you, if you're trading in, I'm paying you so much per pound, or if you're buying, you're giving me so much per pound. So if I hold up this little counterweight and I say, this equals 1 pound, but it really only equals 2/3 of a pound. Right? I'm selling you a pound of wheat or flour, but you're only getting 2/3, but you're paying me. This is why God, in the Old Testament, the weights, right? God hates false weights. That's what he's talking about. How many of y'all have ever been to a real live butcher shop? Right? Where they got the big, so you go to the counter and you go, I want a pound of the hamburger, and I want this and I want that. And he would take whatever it is, and he would take it over, and he had a big scale, and he would put it on the scale, and there's a digital readout on your side, and there's one on his side, right? So you could see how much it weighs. But in the old days, the readout was only on his side, and he would tell you how much it was. You had to trust your butcher. And and there's a phrase that they used to use all the time, and the phrase is putting your thumb on the scale. Y'all ever heard? Anybody ever heard that? Mm-hmm. Putting your thumb on the scale. What did that mean? It meant when the butcher put that big deal on there like that, he would put his thumb down here in one corner and he would press. Oh, well, that's 5 pounds, not 3.5. You owe me more money, right? So you would be forcing an outcome that was not a true representative of the situation. And so that's why he uses the phrase, the false weights and unequal measures. And what it's really referring to, though, is anything that's gained by fraud, theft, deceit, dishonesty. If you're not dealing with others in a fair and balanced way, right, with true balance, if you allow your prejudices or your own prejudgments to cause you to discount someone or to think against them, right? To say, I'm not going to have anything to do with that person over there because look at them. They won't comb their hair. They just must be, right? Back when I was growing up, I don't know, a lot of y'all do, so don't hate me for this. But when I was growing up, people with tattoos were untrustworthy. This was a long time ago, okay? Now that's all changed, right? But it would be wrong of me to make a judgment that if you had a tattoo, I couldn't trust you. Well, that ain't got nothing to do with, the condition of your skin ain't got nothing to do with how you deal with people, what your heart is like. You see what I'm saying? But we'll do that. We'll make these judgments about people, and that's by God considered to be unequal measures or dishonest weights. Okay? All right, so verse 10, standing by itself, just gives a simple way to judge a person's character, right? Oh, I'm sorry, that's, verse 11. I made a mistake there. Need to fix that. Yeah, make a note for me. Verse 11 gives us a simple way to judge a person's character. Their actions. How many of y'all have had people tell you one thing and then do another? We got a rash of that in a certain segment of our population even today, right? People's actions will always give away their true motives, their true beliefs. Okay? In fact, that's the point of James 2:18. Remember James 2:18? Thus also faith by itself, if it has not works, it's dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works. I will show you my faith by my works. This is exactly what James is trying to get across to us. Children are known by the way they act, whether their conduct is pure and whether that is right. I can look at how you live, the actions that you take. I can tell what you believe. I can tell, do you believe in God or not? Okay? And that's what James was trying to tell him, and that's what he's trying to tell here in Proverbs. You can look at somebody and look at their life, and you can tell what they believe by what they do. And he said, even children. I like that, even children.
Not odd children.
Not odd children. Even children.
Even children.
Even children. So if you have 3 kids, they're not judged that way. No. So even children, right? If it's even children, it means that standard applies to adults and also even to children. We judge by actions. Actions will tell us what a person's really up to. I mean, I could tell you, right? Oh, I'm an honest man, and if I'm reaching into your pocket and taking your wallet out of your pocket, am I an honest man? Okay? Jesus taught about this in Matthew 21. You know, remember the one about the man who had 2 sons? He said, go work for me in the garden today. And the first one said, I'll go, sir. And then skipped out, played hooky. And what did the second one say? The second one said, I'm not going to go work for you. And then later on he went, I shouldn't have talked to Dad that way. And he went out and worked in the garden. And Jesus asked the question, which one actually did the will of the Father? The one who said he was going and didn't, or the one who said he wouldn't and did?
Yep.
Well, the second one, right? The one who said he wouldn't but did. That's his actions proved that what he was saying he didn't really believe, right? And that's the point. That's the point of the whole thing. Who did the will of the Father? Children are known by their actions. The last verse in this topic is verse 11. Boy, and does that sound familiar, right? How many of y'all remember Jesus, right? What did Jesus say all the time in his teachings? He who has ears to hear.
Yeah.
He who has ears to hear. You're always like, why did he do that? Was that just like an expression? Well, to us, it's just odd, right? That's just odd. No, it wasn't a normal expression. People weren't wandering through the streets of Jerusalem going, well, he who has ears to hear. Jesus was referring to this scripture, and there's a couple of others too. But he used the phrase, he who has ears. Remember that back in that day, you didn't have any of these. Nobody carried one of these with them, right? These were way too expensive to have. Mm-hmm. Nobody carried a Bible with them. You know where they carried their Bible? Up here. They were taught. That's what they were taught. And we learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, they learn reading and writing, that scripture, and then they learned arithmetic so they could tell where to go in it, right? But they knew this scripture cold. And when Jesus would say, he who has ears to hear, let him hear, he was referring to this verse, he who has ears, right? It would have exploded in the minds of the teachers. Boy, there's another one right there. I got 2 of them in this set.
12.
Oh, okay. I got off on the other one. I just followed it on, didn't I? Well, like my grandmother used to say, I got to put that kind of stuff in there to give y'all something to do. Okay. So, yeah, verse 12. I'm sorry, verse 12. Yeah. So, but this verse would have exploded in their minds, because what Jesus was saying is, if you don't have God-given insight, you can't understand what I'm saying. And those religious, prejudiced, stuck-up, conceited people back in that day were just like the same people back in today, and they can't see past their own nose because they don't have a gift from God of being able to hear the voice of God. And so he who has ears or eyes, let me see, let me back up here. Ears to hear, eyes to see, both are gifts from God. And so what Jesus basically telling everybody is that only people with true faith in God are going to understand this. Only the believers will understand. Because why? God, I think it was Paul said, before a man can come to God, he must believe that he is. Okay? So, next week we're going to pick up, stay tuned, okay. Next week we're going to pick up in verse 13. I got to go home and correct those mistakes. Next time we do this, it'll be perfect.
And you correct your spelling too.
Huh?
Correct your spelling too.
Well, I didn't have no spelling errors.
Yeah.
I had a wrong word. So, but we'll pick up in verse, whichever one it was.
13.
13, yeah. Okay. You all right? Okay. All right. Do we have any prayer requests? Yes, sir.
Curtis Wayne.
Okay. He's doing better, I heard, right?
Yeah, he's breathing on and on. He's still wheezing, and it's a little bit labored, but not a whole lot.
Okay.
Xander still.
Still pray for my grandfather. He passed Friday. This past